Okay, so the next part of this topic for the axial skeleton is the vertebral column and the thoracic cage. Next slide. Vertebral column, we'll just read this, guys. You can read yourselves. Provides protection for the spine, attachments for the back and abdominal muscles. It also has articulations with the skull, the ribs, and the pelvis. The regions of the vertebral column from superior to inferior are the cervical region. There's 7 vertebrae there. The thoracic region, which has 12 vertebrae. Lumbar region, which has 5 vertebrae. The sacrum, or the sacral region. The coccyx, or the coccygeal region. So the easy way to remember how many vertebrae in each region is that you have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. So the cervical region has 7 vertebrae, and they're abbreviated C1 through C7. Lunch at 12, you have thoracic region, that's abbreviated T1 through T12. And dinner at 5, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 through L5. Then there's 5 fused vertebrae in the sacrum, and there's 3 to 5 fused for the coccyx, or the coccygeal region. Next slide. Here's what a coccyx means, cuckoo. So here's a couple pictures of birds, cuckoos, and you can see the beaks there, and that's sort of what the coccyx looks like. So that's why it's named after that. Next slide. To distinguish vertebrae, there's cervical vertebrae have 3 foramen. There's the vertebral foramen, which has a spinal cord going through it, and then there's 2 foramen on the transverse processes. They're called the transverse foramen, and there's a vertebral artery that goes through those. The thoracic vertebrae have a medium-sized body. They have a fairly long spinous process, and it slants down, so it slants inferiorly. There's facets on the transverse process for the ribs. There's also demifacets on the body for the ribs. Lumbar vertebrae have the largest bodies, and they have a spinous process. That's the part that sticks out the back. You can feel that on your back, and that's a spinous process that's called hatchet-shaped. It's kind of flat. Next slide. There's also intervertebral discs found between C2 and the sacrum. The outer part is called the annulus fibrosus, and it's tough and it's fibrocartilage. So here's a disc, and then there's the inner part. So this is the annulus. Well, I'll just point to it. That's annulus fibrosus. Nucleus pulposus is this inner part here, and it's kind of soft and pulpy. And so if you have a disc herniation, this part is what leaks out. So the inside part leaks out, and then it'll compress on a nerve and cause some pain. Or if it compresses on a nerve, it causes some pain. Or if it leaks out enough, the vertebrae will maybe start touching, and that'll cause some pain too. So sacrum and coccyx. Sacrum is a fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae. Sacral just meaning like sacred. It was thought to be a sacred bone in the body. There's different parts to it. Sacrum is basically this. So this is called the base, which is, so the vertebral column sits on the base. Then there's the alae, which are the wings. Those are on the sides there. There's the sacral foramina. There's little holes coming down here. And then there's 2 superior articular processes here and here, where the vertebrae sit on top of that. And then they're on the sides here and here are called the auricular surfaces, here and there. And those articulate with the iliac portion of the pelvis, the os coxa. And that forms what's called, so this is the sacrum, and it articulates with the ilium. There's an ilium coming around here. So that's the ilium. So that's called the sacroiliac or sacroiliac joint, or SI joint. So you may have heard of the SI joint. Some people have SI joint pain here, where those articulations occur. And then the coccyx is down here, and a little guy down there, a little triangular bone down there. It's fused of 3 to 5, around 4 vertebrae. Next slide. Yeah, spinal curvature in adults But you have a single curve when you're a fetus. So you have a single curvature. It's all curved posteriorly. When you start lifting your head up, you get an anterior curvature, and you still have the rest of the posterior curvature until you learn to walk, and then you get the anterior, posterior, anterior, and posterior curvatures. So when you hold your head up, you get an anterior curvature. When you start learning to walk, your lumbar region then projects anteriorly, and you start being able to hold yourself up. So that gives you the 4 curves. Next slide. So your vertebral column, so you have your cervical region, your thoracic region, your lumbar region, and your sacral region, and your coccyx. Here's your intervertebral discs, which is all between each of these vertebrae, and it has the 2 parts to it, the annulus fibrosus and the nucleus pulposus. Sorry, I blanked for a second. And so cervical region, you have 7 vertebrae through here, and you have 12 vertebrae, sorry, went too far, 12 vertebrae down through here, and 5 vertebrae in the lumbar region. So breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. Next slide. So here shows the anterior, posterior, curvature of the spine, and the discs between each of the vertebrae, the intervertebral discs. You also have these foramen here, all these are intervertebral foramen all the way up, and that's where nerves will exit from the spinal cord, which goes all the way up through the middle of this. The spinal cord goes through there, and nerves exit out through these foramen. So that's where nerves come out of and go. Okay, so next slide. Here's a typical thoracic vertebra. What you have is you have the body, okay? Then you have a spinous process. You have a transverse process on here, as well as here's another transverse process over here, okay? And the spinal cord is in the middle of the intervertebral foramen. You also have a section of the vertebra called the pedicle. You have another section called the lamina. And here's another lamina here, and here's another pedicle here. And sticking up off of the pedicle, which means a little foot, is the superior articular process. And you have facets of this on the superior articular process, and those will articulate with the next vertebrae that sits on top of it. So, and that vertebra will have what's called an inferior articular process. So the vertebrae on top has an inferior articular process that articulates with the superior articular process of the vertebra below it. And then on the sides, you have here, you have a facet, and the rib comes in this way, hits this, and then goes over and touches this. So here's how your ribs go. So rib has a facet on it that hits this facet on the transverse process, and also touches 2 facets that are on, 1 or 2 facets on the body of the vertebra. Okay, next slide. Oh, sorry, one other thing. The pedicle and the lamina, each of these 2 things, this makes what's called the vertebral arch. Okay, and also if you have the nucleus pulposus, so here's your disc will be here. So if it squeezes out, and so nerves will be exiting out through here. This is the intervertebral foramen here and here. So if it squeezes out and starts pressing on those nerves there, then what they'll do sometimes is do what's called laminectomy, and they'll take out a little bit of this lamina, and it allows the spinal cord and everything to shift backwards posteriorly a little bit, so it relieves some pressure off the disc that's pressing on this nerve that's coming out. Okay, next slide. So here's another diagram showing the vertebral arch here, going across and going all the way around. So there's a vertebral arch. Spinous process here, the transverse process, and another transverse process. So there's 2 transverse processes, 1 spinous process, and you can feel those spinous processes. There's one that's really easy to feel, It's the called the vertebral prominence, and there's a bump like right where your shoulders and your neck come together, and there's kind of a bump back there, and that's actually a spinous process sticking off the C7 vertebra, and that's called the vertebral prominence because it has a very prominent spinous process. So, and here's your here's a demifacet here for a rib to come in. So a rib comes in. There's an articulation here, and a rib comes in and touches there, and then goes back and curves forward. So, and same thing on this side, comes in there like that. So there's your ribs. Next slide. So here's a comparison of cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. So we've been looking at the thoracic vertebrae as the prime example of what a vertebrae has. You have the transverse process here and here, spinous process, vertebral foramen, superior articulating facets and processes, and you have the body, a fairly large body on the of the vertebra, as well as the vertebral arch. If you look at the difference between the thoracic vertebrae and the cervical vertebrae, you'll notice that there's a vertebral foramen, but the spinous process is much smaller. It's not as long as the cervical vertebrae, sorry, the thoracic vertebrae. There's also two parts to it. It's called bifid or bifurcated, which means it has two sticky outy parts, two parts that stick out. So here's your lamina and your pedicles, like this little tiny bit there and tiny bit there. And here's the lamina here, so this makes your vertebral arch here. And here's your transverse processes here with a foramen in it, and that's a transverse foramen. And I'll show you what that transverse foramen is for. It's for vertebral artery, but I'll show you that on one of the models here in the lab in a second. So you have three holes in a cervical vertebrae. You just have one hole here and one hole in a lumbar vertebrae too. So one hole. So that's the easy way to tell cervical vertebrae from the thoracic. You can just look at the number of holes that are in it. You have two transverse foramen in a cervical vertebrae and one in vertebral foramen. And in the thoracic vertebrae and lumbar vertebrae, you only have one hole. It's the vertebral foramen. Then in the lumbar vertebrae, you have the lamina here and here, pedicle here and here. Superior articular process is moved posterior a little bit, and the transverse processes they point out to the side rather than pointing backwards or posteriorly like the thoracic vertebrae. These guys point pretty much horizontally, the transverse processes. It's still got a very prominent spinous process here. It's a spinous, it's funny it's not labeled in this picture, spinous process. And it is what's called hatchet shaped, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. If you look at sideways, it's kind of thin and looks like a hatchet. So, and the body is also very prominent in a lumbar vertebra because lumbar vertebrae are down low and they're holding up. It's where the entire upper body is resting on those 5 lumbar vertebrae, which also helps you figure out why a lot of times when you have back pain, it's in the lumbar region because those vertebrae are there. There's nothing else around them other than some muscles to help hold everything up. So the whole upper body is resting on those lumbar vertebrae and those discs. So that's why people have a lot of problems with those discs in that area of the back. Next slide. So, and so here's the cervical vertebrae looking at C1 through C7. Here's your vertebral prominence. You can feel this spinous process here on the back. Go back up to C1. Here's C1, the atlas. And in the little video that I posted, I talked about the superior articular process here and here. On the C1, the atlas, and on C2, the axis, it has the dens sticking up here. So you can pivot and your head rotates sideways, and so you can shake your head no. And let's see. Then you have all these different vertebrae going down C3 through C7. So we're talking about the cervical region here, this upper region of the vertebral column. Next slide. So here's just a view of the cervical vertebrae. So this is the way it would look inside you. So this is anterior, and this is posterior. So you're looking at this just as kind of like it, as if it was in use. Kind of flip it up a little bit. I think it makes it a little bit easier to see what it looks like. Transverse foramen here, vertebral foramen here. This is the part where the dens would stick up through, because this is C1 vertebrae, so that's where the dens would be. Dens will fit in that spot there. There's actually a ligament that goes across here. The dens isn't just flopping around in here. There's a ligament that holds it in place, and so that's what makes the posterior part of the that holds the dens in place and allows your C1 vertebrae to shake your head back, or C2 vertebrae to allow your head to shake back and forth and say no. Next slide. Next slide. So here's an actual vertebra showing the transverse processes and the transverse foramen. Next slide. Here's a C2 vertebra. There's the dens, the odontoid process here, superior articular facets here and here, the vertebral foramen, transverse foramen here and here, and the bifurcated, see there's two parts to it, spinous process here. Next slide. Next slide. So here's the actual picture of an actual C2 vertebra, and we have the dens here and the spinous process, and you can see it's sort of bifurcated here. It's a little bit hard. It's kind of looks like a little worn down there. So, and your vertebral foramen there, and you can't see the transverse foramen very well. They're underneath down here, underneath the superior articular processes. Next slide. So this is exaggerated a little bit to show the transverse foramen on these well, this is a C3 vertebrae, so you're already going to see that. I was thinking of C2. This is C3 vertebrae. So same things, bifurcated spinous process, the vertebral foramen for the spinal cord there. Next slide. Next slide. So here's an actual vertebra. This is C3, so you have an obvious transverse foramen, vertebral foramen, body. So you're starting to get more of a body. Once you get down to C3, you actually have bodies. C1 and C2 don't really have a body to them. And the bifurcated spinous process is very, very obvious, very prominent as you go down from C3 through C7. Next slide.